Okay, good morning, everybody. It's a couple of minutes before 10, but I think everybody's here, so we may as well make a start. So good morning and welcome to day 10 of the hearings in Epping Forest. And can everybody hear me? My microphone sounds quieter than it did yesterday, but everybody can hear me. Good, thank you. Okay, I think I've met everybody before, but in case not, I'm Louise Phillips, the Inspector appointed by the Secretary of State to examine the plan, and the Programme Officer is Louise St. John Howe. If you have a mobile phone, could you please ensure that it's turned off or switched to silent, please? And do we have any fire procedures planned today?
There is no fire drill planned today, so if the fire alarm sounds, we need to exit by the door that you came in and down the stairs and assemble on the green behind. If for any reason that's blocked, we can exit through the door behind me and down the stairs into the council car park and then round to the green. The toilets are located in the stairwells as you came in.
Thank you. Today with the agenda, I think everybody who's here is here all day. We're not waiting for anyone to turn up in the afternoon, so really I intend to just push on through the agenda. We'll take a break at about 11:30 and then see how we're doing by lunchtime, but we'll see how far we can get with it today. Filming, just to remind everybody again, I know I've said this before, but I think I'm required to say it at the beginning of each session. The meeting will be broadcast live to the internet. It will be capable of subsequent repeated viewing, and copies will be made available upon request. Your image is likely to be captured as part of this meeting, and this could infringe your human and data protection rights. So if you have any concerns, as usual, please speak to the webcasting officer. And I must remind you to use your microphone so that anybody who wants to watch later on can hear what you're saying. So without further ado, if we could just go around and do some introductions, please. We'll start with the council.
Good morning, Madam. My name is Mrs. Louise Humphreys. I'm a solicitor instructed by Epping Forest District Council. And from the council today, to my right, we have Miss Alison Blom-Cooper and Mr. James Rogers. And then throughout the course of the hearing, as we need them, there will also be Miss Ione Braddock and Mr. Tai Tsui.
Good morning, Madam. My name is David Keane from David Locke Associates, here on behalf of the Fairfield Partnership.
I'm Olivier Spencer from Andrew Martin Planning, representing Miller Homes for the East of Harlow site.
Good morning, Councillor Elizabeth Byrne, Theydon Boys Parish Council.
Hi, good morning. I'm Dr. John Warren. I'm a resident of Theydon Boys for nearly 40 years. I'm currently chairman of Theydon Boys Action Group, which has a mission statement to protect Greenbelt around our village. Thank you.
Good morning, I'm Tessa Craig from the Canal and River Trust. I'm here in relation to policy DM17.
Andrew Smith, the Epping Society.
Morning, Roger Lowry, also the Epping Society.
Chris Pond, Town, District and County Councillor representing Loughton Town Council, but my colleague Julia Riddle is unable to be with us today.
Good morning, I'm Trevor Faulkner from Pigeon Investment, representing land interests in Epping East. Thank you.
Okay, everybody, so unless anyone has any specific questions, we'll move straight on with policy DM11, waste recycling facilities in new development. Now, I had no specific questions about this policy and still have no specific questions, but I think from the statements, Pigeon might have wanted to raise a point about the flexibility of the policy, and the Epping Society about the lack of provision of civic amenity points, otherwise known as dumps. Yeah. To make sure we all know what we're talking about. So, if either of you'd like to do that, we'll begin there.
Thank you, Mum. At present, in terms of dumps, the nearest provisions are outside the district in Harlow, in fact on the other side of Harlow, and a long way south through the district. Therefore, anyone needing to get rid of stuff without either paying the council their fee for a special collection, or if it won't go in the bins, has to undertake quite a long journey down the road system. As the population increases, to make the system more sustainable, I wonder if the council are considering the provision of additional dumps through the district. If I may add a second point, the housing standards that our developers are going to have to stick to, can I ask if there is a requirement for the wheelie bins to have sighting space provision, a corner or whatever? Because we have one or two developments recently where the wheelie bins, for whatever reason, are left on the pavements or on the front gardens in the roads. Thank you.
Thank you. If I just take Councillor Pond. Sorry.
Madam, I never thought I'd have to accuse you of using non-politically correct language, but these are not dumps. Sorry. These are recycling centres for household waste, and they are provided by the County Council as the Waste Disposal Authority, as opposed to the Waste Collection Authority, which is EFDC. Now, I'm always prepared to give EFDC support where they deserve it, and waste collection is one of those areas they do deserve it. The provision of an additional recycling centre for household waste is very dear to my heart, and it may be for the information of the meeting if I say that that is the County Council, are looking at a better site, more centrally suited, but not in Epping. So I absolutely accept what the Epping Society say. There is a journey needed. On the other hand, as far as planning is concerned, I'm not sure that the policy as drafted includes the requirement on developers to provide adequate waste bin storage and collection facilities from their developments. I think that should certainly be written in, and as I understood it from the County Council, that may be written into the next iteration of the Essex Design Guide, but it is certainly an aspect of air quality and of congestion if, for instance, a development of 20 houses is not required to provide a central point from which waste can be collected, and I would hope that could be properly factored into the plan.
Mr. Faulkner.
Thank you, Mum. Don't really have anything really to add to what's actually put in our particular matter statement. Clearly all we're actually asking for is sufficient flexibility within the application of the policy in terms of site specifics and locations, and also to respect the council's approach may change over time. For example, there could be a need for additional bins or different approaches or innovative ways to actually recycle. So it's really just making sure there's sufficient flexibility in the application of the policy and site circumstances. Thank you.
How are you concerned that it doesn't provide that at the moment? What change do you think is required? So as we've just heard, it doesn't specify particular areas for waste storage, for example. So I'm wondering how could it be more flexible?
That I don't necessarily have an answer to. It's just really making sure there is that flexibility in the policy approach.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
In that case, Ms. Blom-Cooper, would you be able to come back on the points raised? I think Mr. Pond, were you saying that it's not the responsibility really of this council to have to provide the waste recycling facility? So it's more about the sort of the issues to discuss here today, and more about whether this policy provides sufficient space on site.
Yes, Madam. It's the responsibility of the Waste Disposal Authority to provide the sites, the RCHWs. So I think that should not necessarily form part of this plan. However, my argument is, if anything, is the word adequate. I think adequate should read proper rather than adequate, because one of the issues we find sitting on development committees is that the facilities provided are cramped and meagre.
Thank you. Okay. Ms. Blom-Cooper.
I think Councillor Pond has helpfully made the point that we're not the Waste Disposal Authority, so I won't dwell on that. In relation to his comments about facilities on site, I think the policy DM11 does set that out quite clearly. It says all development which generates waste will be required to make on-site provision for general waste, the separation of recyclable materials and organic material for composting. And it then goes on to set out how we should ensure adequate dedicated internal and external space should be provided. I don't think it needs to be amended, and we're not proposing any amendments.
In terms of the wheelie bin point made by Mr. Lowry, I was looking at point 3, Mr. Lowry. It does say that that it should be located and screened to avoid nuisance and adverse impact on visual and other amenity to occupiers and neighbouring uses. Does that not give you comfort?
It is about the size, because we have existing recent developments where, for whatever reason, the residents find the spaces designed or allocated for their bins simply aren't convenient, so they're left on roadways, pavements, front grass. It must be because the space is just not, they just don't consider the space appropriate for the purpose they're trying to use it.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, we'll move on now to policy DM 12. Concerning basements. Now, there are a number of amendments to proposed to this policy, which we'll come to in time. But my first question on my original matters, issues and questions, MIQs number 25, concerned part B2, and asked, will this be effective in securing basement development of a subordinate scale in cases where the garden area is large relative to the size of the building? And the council has given us an explanation in its statement, which perhaps it can run through in a minute. But I'll say now, I still remain concerned that the policy, as worded, could invite proposals up to 50% of the curtilage. And this could potentially be problematic in cases where small houses have large gardens. So I remain concerned about that. But perhaps if a term I don't really understand either is each area of garden. So perhaps if you could just explain what you're trying to achieve with part B of this policy and how you see it working in practice with the concerns I've expressed in mind.
Thank you, Madam. In relation to your point about each area of the garden, I think we're referring to side, front and rear gardens, just to make it clear that we're not necessarily talking just about the garden space to the rear, but anything to the side or to the front of the property as well. We are seeking, obviously, to ensure that there aren't disproportionate additions. The general standard they used by other authorities has been 50%. If you feel that it should be reduced, I don't think we would have a specific problem with that. We have proposed an amendment which is set out in the schedule as amendment number 19A to make it clearer about basement development within the green belt. And we consider that in order to better reflect that paragraph 89 of the NPPF bullet point 3, we should amend that to make it clear that we're not just looking at within the green belt about their acceptability in terms of disproportionate additions, but also the openness on the green belt. So we've proposing to add in would not result in disproportionate additions over and above the size of the original building, or which would not have a greater impact on the openness of the green belt, either themselves or cumulatively. And we think that that is important because even if it's not disproportionate, it could have an impact on the openness of the green belt as a result of the addition of light wells or roof lights, and indeed ventilation shafts, which often come with basement development.
So in relation to proposals outside the Greenbelt, is it essentially the approach that it would be sort of treated as any other proposed extension, if you like, and so the same sorts of, is there a need, and I can ask this to everybody else, is there any need to treat basement proposals outside of the Greenbelt any differently from any other extension proposal? So in a way, is what has been put in sufficient to allow a planning officer to judge whether it would be subordinate, and the 50% actually almost places a helpful limit on it? I'm trying to work out whether that's helpful or whether it sort of invites things that might be disproportionate. But there is a question as to whether there's any reason to treat a basement proposal as any different to a above ground proposal in that sense, if you consider character. Mr. Smith.
Now, that's rather what I thought when I read all this. Paragraphs A to F almost seem to reflect what ought to be elsewhere in the planning policy. Whether you're building a basement or an above ground extension or new building, you shouldn't adversely affect the structural stability of the host of neighbouring buildings, etc., etc., etc. You shouldn't increase flood risk. You shouldn't do harm to buildings and all those other things. So I really wasn't sure why they were there. Someone seemed to have it in for basements. As far as perhaps I'll just pick up another point slightly related to that. If the amendment DM12A5 is made, it says a basement can only be built if it can show that it conserves or enhances the local natural historic environment. I stretch my brain to work out how a basement, which is invisible below ground, can ever be said to conserve or enhance anything. I can see you might avoid damage, but I don't see how it can conserve or improve anything because you can't see it. So it seems to me A5 modification means you can't build a basement.
Well, conserve is the way you'd preserve.
Elsewhere it says you mustn't damage historic artefacts, which we all agree with, I'm sure, or natural ones. So that's covered elsewhere in the planning policies, I'm sure. But to have to prove that a subterranean development basement, etc., where it can be demonstrated that the proposal will conserve or enhance the local natural and historic environment, I don't know how you do that. It's invisible. Prove it doesn't do any harm, but I don't know how you prove it improves it. So that's a sort of point on that. I don't know whether you want to talk about Greenbelt separately, because I know someone else here wants to talk about that aspect.
We'll come on to Greenbelt, because
Yeah.
we'll come on to that in the proposed amendments part G. It's really this part B I want to discuss.
So I tend to agree with the question you asked, ma'am, that if most of these points, all of them actually, ought to be covered elsewhere in planning policies, whether it's above or below ground. The only question in my mind is, would there be a separate sub-limit for the floor area of a basement for a non-Greenbelt house? I don't know what my view is on that.
Councillor Pond.
Ma'am, I do agree with you at your original question. I'm not happy with the policy as drafted, and I think the reason for that is that it is an historical one, in that the different authorities which were predecessor planning authorities to Epping Forest District Council had different requirements for building lines, and in different zones of each authority there were different building lines. So, for instance, in parts of the Loughton Urban District Council's plan of 1926, in some cases there was a 100-foot building line, which means that nowadays, sitting on planning committees, we can get quite enormous basements suggested. And so I don't know whether stipulating 50% of a garden area is a very sensible measure. I think there might be an absolute limit in terms of feet or metres rather than percent of garden area, particularly because, as far as I'm aware, the word garden has never been judicially defined, and so many of these houses have a car park in front of their dwellings rather than the garden. I think that would be arguable. I think this policy is right in its intention, but it does need a certain amount of adjustment.
Thank you. Dr. Warren.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, Inspector, I share your concerns also about the up to 50% of garden area. I often find that when maybe a helpful indication is used of percentage, developers always go for the maximum. I've said in my hearing statement that it looks to me as if EFDC have tried to, what I call, roll over from the GPDO, where you can cover 50% of your garden area with single-storey development. However, for above-ground development, it can't be connected to the house and it must be incidental to the use of the house. Clearly, a basement would be connected to the house and it can contain habitable rooms. So I don't think the comparison there is strictly the same. One can also look at more recent change, well, the last few years of GPDO, where you can go back, is it 6 metres on a semi-detached single storey and 8 metres on a detached? So, you know, possibly one could use those sort of figures as the metrics rather than a percentage, because I also share your concern when you have large rear gardens. Also, it begs the question, if it's 50% of the garden area under basically a copycat GPDO, can the applicant then also cover 50% of the rear garden with above-ground single-storey development incidental to the use of the land? Incidental to the use of the house. My concern really is one of change in land use and, intensification of land use and the knock-on impact that could have. If you've got a 3-bedroomed house and you put a basement under there and convert it into a 5-bedroom house, then, you know, you're going to have more cars, you're going to have more sort of garden paraphernalia. So, yeah, I share your concerns. I just put those points to you for your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Spurn.
Yes, I think Parish Council in its statement as well, something very similar. We said, should it not be linked to what we call the curtilage of the building, in other words, to the building, which, if you look at permitted development rights, again, will only extend to a certain proportion either side and to the rear. Certainly not to the front garden. I mean, that may be a consideration taken into account, but this idea of, I think, 50%, when that garden could be very, very substantial, and I think we do have concerns of it. I mean, I don't think we can come up with a formula today, but it does seem ironic that, as you say, you have permitted development rights with respect to the dwelling house, and those are limited by the GPDO, and then you turn around and say that you're going to have basements that would cover a very substantial area. And it's not just within the green belt, because obviously traditionally houses built in the 1930s could have a 120-foot garden. It's a very, very substantial amount, and I don't think that in some ways, how can I say it, planning doesn't really allow for that amount of extensive development, usually within a policy. There are constraints for obvious reasons. It just seems that the formula of 50% of the garden area is perhaps not the one that we would have supported. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Let's hear from the council.
I think there were 2 reasons for the 50% limit. One is to take account of permitted development rights, and of course you can do some basement development within permitted development, but also recognising that we wanted to ensure the retention of sufficient garden area where plants and trees can grow, because often one of the impacts of basements is that it affects what you can grow by way of lawn and other plants above the basement. And that has been a particular problem, I know, from experience of dealing with such development in the London boroughs. It started to be an issue here, particularly in the south of the district, and that was the reason for inclusion of this policy.
Okay, well, I'll give some thought to it. In light of what you've heard, do you still remain of the view that it's necessary to retain a percentage limit, full stop, and that the 50% is the right limit to retain?
We think it's an appropriate limit, and we wouldn't want development to, regardless of the size of the host building, to be more than that, for the reasons that I've set out, of retaining a reasonable amount of usable garden for the future occupiers of the building. Part B itself already does require the basement to be subordinate to the host building. So I think, you know, that is a matter of judgment, and that's why we've put not exceed 50%. That would be the upper limit. On some buildings, it would obviously not be appropriate to go up to that limit.
Okay, last point on that, and then we'll move on to the
I just
next
want to
one.
ask one question. How is the council defining subordinate in that particular instance? What are you using to define subordinate? Because that will come up when somebody asks what is subordinate to the property.
I think that's a matter for judgment on each and every case, and it's it's one of those things that you can't have hard and fast rules for.
Okay, as I say, I'll give some thought to that. The next question I wanted to ask is what's expected in a basement construction management statement as required in Part F. And the council has explained that a basement construction management statement should fall within the general definition of a construction management statement provided in the glossary. Now, I'll take comments on that if anyone wishes, but I think if that's what's intended, then it should be explained in the supporting text, possibly in paragraph 4.85, because I didn't think that was clear. And when you combine that with the technical requirements associated with the basement impact statement, it tends to suggest that something more specific is required. So if that's the intention, I think it would be helpful just to explain that in paragraph 4.85. Does anyone else have any comments on that specific part? No. Thank you. Okay, and then the next point on my agenda was, does the policy and supporting text provide adequate guidance to developers about issues which might need to be addressed for proposals affecting the historic environment? Should it refer to the need to consider archaeology, the historic fabric of heritage assets, and the effect of an altered layout, etc.? And this was raised by Historic England. Now we have proposed amendments in the schedule 18, 19, and 20. And essentially, those are to amend Part A5 to require the conservation or enhancement of the historic environment, as set out in Policy DM7, and paragraph 4.83 of the supporting text to refer to the historic environment, and it's also proposed to add archaeological remains to the definition of heritage assets in the glossary. Historic England are content with those?
Yes, those are
amendments?
included in the Statement of Common Ground with Historic England, which is reference ED24.
We've obviously had a comment from Mr. Smith in relation to 18. Mr. Pond.
This is a comment in relation to your numbered paragraph 20, Inspector. Is that in order to raise it now, or would you like to deal with them in order?
No, go ahead.
Amendment 20. I alluded yesterday to the signal failure of the District Council and the Planning Authority to keep their local list up to date, which has meant that when a planning application comes in, we have to investigate whether or not it might constitute a non-designated heritage asset in accordance with the provisions of the planning framework. I think for that reason, where it is defined, where it says heritage asset includes, I think it should include the paragraph in between commas, but is not confined to designated heritage assets and assets identified in the local listing.
Anything else? Council?
Thank you, Madam. I'm not sure that it's necessary, because includes, to my mind, would mean that it's not exhaustive list. But I don't think we have any objections to including that in the definition.
Thank you. And then in relation to other concerns I'd identified from the statements was Thaden Boys Parish Council remained concerned about Part G in relation to developments in the Greenbelt. We've already seen proposed amendment 19A. Does that address your concerns, Thaden Boys? Thank you.
I just looked at it. The one thing I'm wondering with the wording, because I just looked at this, where it starts with the sentence, within the Greenbelt, basement developments may be considered acceptable, providing they do not result in disproportionate additions over and above the size of the original building, or which would not have a greater impact on the openness of the Greenbelt. Should it be, comma, either themselves or cumulative developments? Because I'm wondering whether the first part of the sentence, disproportionate additions over and above the size of the original building, either themselves or cumulatively with other developments, and then also which would not have a greater impact on the openness of the Greenbelt, either themselves or cumulatively with other developments. Because what we sometimes see is someone puts in a proposal to extend a property which is quite substantial but doesn't take it to being a disproportionate addition, and then by a separate application comes back and adds the basement. What I'm thinking more is clarity in terms of how that policy is interpreted, because we have seen on some occasions a house which, for instance, was extended quite substantially but was allowed because it wasn't disproportionate in terms of the planning officer, and then a separate application came back with a 35% further increase in volume, which would have taken it well over if it had been considered at one time. So I'm simply just in terms of, again, it's one of these things that I suppose when we talked about yesterday, I'm sorry to say it again, an SPD on Greenbelt might help with some explanation, but I'm really looking at the text now of what we have in front of us. So is it meant to be read, result in disproportionate additions over and above the size of the original building, either themselves or cumulatively with the other developments? Does that need to apply to both parts of the sentence? Does that make sense? Have I made it clear? Alison, have I? Thank you. In other words, should the text be split up in a way that explains that, if that's relevant? Thank you.
And your view, Ms Byrne, is that it should apply to both parts of the sentence?
I think for the sake of clarity, yes.
Right. Okay. Did you want to comment on that?
We feel as drafted that that's what it does do, and that we don't need to amend. And that, that's what the usual convention is to put it at the end to actually indicate that it applies to both bits.
Okay, Dr. Warren.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I support what Councillor Byrne has just said, and we see many instances in Thaden Boys where developers develop in a piecemeal fashion and get either a replacement building which is, larger than the original, or they get additions, and then having got that, they go for the basement and they get that. I'm pleased to see the changes that EFDC have made. Pardon me. Conceptually, I really wonder whether this is something akin to what they didn't want to do yesterday under DM4, which was to come up with specific Greenbelt policy plans, but I won't dwell on that any longer. We've thrashed that one out yesterday, and people know my views, and I think others around the table share my views from residents' groups. What I'm concerned about with the current amendment is I would like to see the word encroachment in there, because time and time again, councillors and very often officers take the view about greenbelt openness, which we have a current policy on conspicuous development, GB7A, that if you can't see it, it doesn't matter. And I've heard this said for basement development, well, it's not harming the openness of the green belt. But in my opinion, and I've seen other planning inspectors on appeals take the same view, or basically I share the view that they take, that it increases the size and it causes encroachment into the green belt. So I would feel happier if not just openness of the green belt is put in this amendment, but somewhere we have encroachment as well. But I put that to you for your consideration. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Smith.
Yeah, I'd like to question the word size of the original building. If you have a building which is, let's say, 500 or 600 square metres footprint and you've got 3 floors, is this saying you can have 2,000 square metres of basement extension? Or does this intend to apply to the footprint of the building? I think it should be clear. And I would go back to the point we were discussing earlier on in relation to some sort of sublimit for basement developments outside the green belt. We should have a sublimit also for within the green belt for the sorts of reasons Dr. Warren just referred to, that by increasing the volume of a building in the green belt, you increase the number of people who live there, you increase the amount of activity that goes on, almost certainly the number of vehicles travelling to and from, and that's all part of damaging the openness of the green belt.
Council, do you want to come back on those points?
Just to say that the obviously encroachment is one of the purposes of the green belt, so we feel that encroachment would be covered by green belt policy more generally, and the extensions or alterations of buildings is also covered by in paragraph 89 of the MPPF in terms of the extension or alteration of buildings not resulting in disproportionate additions over and above the size of the original building. And our amendment seeks to directly quote that.
Okay, thank you for that. Does anyone else want to say anything about policy DM12? You haven't already said. Mr. Smith.
The NPPF is designed for national coverage. In Epping Forest, we know that 92% of our land area is greenbelt. I think it is justified for us to have different policies. And the word size does imply that if you've got a 3-storey building of 700 square metres each floor, that you can build 2,000 square metres of basement. I don't think that's justified. I don't think it's appropriate for the green belt, and I think it is reasonable to limit it in some other way. The footprint would be one way, or an absolute square metre limit or something would be appropriate in this district, with 92% being metropolitan green belt.
I think it is covered because we've explicitly stated that it shouldn't be comprised of more than 1 storey. And I think that does mean that the size of development would be limited. And again, referring back to the fact it has to be subordinate to the host building.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. We'll move on to policy DM13, advertisements. And I'd asked whether the blanket approach in part 5 concerning illuminated signs was justified, and whether it should be expressed in terms of its apparent aim to protect residential amenity and living conditions. And in response, the Council has proposed Amendment 21 on the schedule to clarify that illuminated signs will not be permitted in residential areas in the interests of amenity, which includes protecting the general characteristics of an area. However, the Council considers it justified to retain the blanket ban, if you like, on illuminated signs in such areas in order to protect their general characteristics. Does anyone have any concerns or comments about that? Could there be any unintended consequences of such an approach? Councillor Pond.
I would agree with the Council's approach in this. I don't think it would be unduly restrictive. The application, particularly of internally illuminated signs where there are flats or other residential accommodation nearby, can be grievous to the amenity of the residents. And so I would therefore concur with the Council.
Ms Smith.
The Epping Society concurs strongly.
Okay, seems to be general agreement there. The only question then I would ask in relation to the proposed amendment is whether it makes it clear that that the amenity covers both the visual and, if you like, residential amenity, living conditions. So that the point made by Mr. Councillor Pond is the sort of, it's more a living conditions type thing, but also I guess the characteristics of a residential area would be visual. I don't know whether it's worth the amendment almost conveying both sides of amenity rather than just the visual amenity. But in principle, the amendment's acceptable.
We'd be happy to.
If you could try to do that, then okay, that's fine. Okay, so moving on then to DM 14, shop fronts and on-street dining. I'd asked only one question, whether part A2 should refer to the conservation of historic materials and features rather than original materials and features, in response to representations made by Historic England. And in response, the Council proposes Amendment 22, which basically does what Historic England requested. Anyone, any concerns, comments? Ms Smith.
The Epping Society has repeatedly asked that there should be at least guidance or a policy in relation to the principal retail frontages in the market towns of this district. It's not a lot of point in retaining the original shopfront material in an ugly 1960s or 1970s building that replaced an historic building in the town in those days. You'll just get a repetition of plate glass. What we're trying to get is some sort of encouragement to have a market town appearance in our old towns to recover what once there was. I'm not sure that could be a policy unless the policy simply referred to some sort of guidance which the council might issue to encourage shopkeepers to make their shops look more attractive. I'm not sure the right place to do it because I'm not a planning expert. We don't know how else to try and get this done.
Thank you. Councillor Pond.
I entirely agree with what Mr Smith has said, Madam. Epping Town was, I think, the first of many in the country to benefit from a civic trust exercise in the 1960s. But that has been eroded. The beneficial effects of that have been eroded over the years by not having a policy such as this. So I'm very glad to see it in there. Would it be in order, Madam, to address a comment to B2 in policy DM14 at this point? Thank you. One of the issues we have, and it is the subject, I think, of a current enforcement case, is that without planning permission, people who wish to use forecourts or part of the pavement as a dining or drinking area have fixed barriers to the surface, to the ground surface, thereby reducing out of hours the pedestrian circulation space. So I'm wondering if policy B small brackets 2 might amplify the question of and not create a permanent enclosure by stating explicitly that any enclosure be removed when the dining or drinking area is not in use.
Council?
Just a couple of comments in relation to the point just raised by Councillor Pond. We haven't included that because we feel that would be more appropriately covered by a condition if that was something that was required. I think the policy position means that it would have to be removable, and then if we wanted to ensure that it was removed when not in use, I think that would be a condition on a planning any planning permission. In relation to the points about retention of shop fronts, A1 does seek the retention of traditional shop fronts, so I think that covers that point. And I think by amending little 2 from original to historic, I think we are making the point that it's the historic features that we're seeking to retain.
I think Mr. Smith's point was more about trying to recover things that have been lost, and whether there could be any encouragement through the policy to adopt a particular design that's been watered down, if you like.
I think that's a matter for negotiation on particular proposals that are put forward, and I think the policy provides the provision for that. We do say that shop fronts should respect and where possible improve. Well, we could say shop fronts should respect and where possible improve the historic character of the site and its surrounding area, if that's helpful.
Where would that be? Where would that be? That sounded positive. I think people on the other side of the table would appreciate that, but I can't see where you mean.
We need to think about where we might add that in, but in principle, happy to do that.
That sounded positive. Yep. Okay, thank you. Can we move on to DM15? Yep. Which is managing and reducing flood risk. That's okay. Yep.
Could just give us a minute to swap.
Fine. Okay. Okay, so my question 30 asked whether regard had been had to the Essex SUDS design guide and to the Environment Agency risk of flooding from surface water maps in preparing the plan. And should these documents be added to the list of key evidence and the relevant supporting text? We heard obviously the Council's approach to the key evidence sections yesterday, so we won't repeat that now. But essentially, I think proposed Amendment 23 is an addition to paragraph 4.106 of the supporting text to clarify that development proposals should take account of the EA's risk of flooding from surface water maps. And 24 makes reference to the Essex County Council SUDS design guide as a potential source of technical guidance. Does anyone want to comment on those amendments, which I think are helpful? No? Okay.
Madam, just to point out that we were also putting in the Syria SUDS manual into that text, taking account of our proposal to remove Amendment 29, and therefore move that into one of the lists of guidance. So that comes from policy DM16. Just to clarify that.
Okay. Thank you. And then my next question, 31, concerned the application of the sequential and exception test as required by national policy. This concerns Part B of DM 15. And in response, the Council has proposed Amendment 25. And this is an amendment to Part B to clarify that the need to pass the exception test applies to both allocated and windfall development, but that allocated sites are deemed to have passed the sequential test, provided that the proposal is in accordance with the plan. Any comments on that? Councillor Pond.
Madam, I strongly object to the exception for sites allocated within the plan, because that would imply they have already been thoroughly tested against the criteria, which I believe they have not.
Do you want to elaborate on that point, Councillor Pond, so that we understand your concern?
The concern is that for a site allocated in the plan, that the full application of the tests have not, my concern is that they have not necessarily been already conducted, and therefore when it comes to a planning application on that site, we should be able to consider whether the proper procedure has been gone through and not simply take it as a given because it's an allocated site within the plan.
Does your comment relate both to the sequential and exception test? Mr. Lowry.
Thank you, Mum. My points about flooding, I hope they're in the right place in your questioning. I'm not sure. And they are apparently quite naive. 3, has the Council, as well as all these measures which are described in here, has there been any consultation of a local community about specific flood activity? I'm thinking of the site proposed near Brook Road. The name may be a clue, which I'm sure has been subject to all the studies of flood risk by everybody, but have they spoken, for example, to some of the older folks there, who we have, who will tell them that that area floods very extensively, maybe 1 year in 3, 1 year in 4. Secondly, have the people engaged in this process been made aware that there are seasonal stream flows? Our town, and I know Loughton as well, have dendritic patterns of seasonal streams which flow across roads, through gardens, under little culverts which often block and flood. And they represent flood hazards, not on a big scale, but to 5-10 houses, but could also represent a flood risk to the developments proposed in this plan. So have they been allowed for? And thirdly, I notice in Amendment 30, I think it's 30, down the bottom of that page, surface water management plans have not yet been produced for all areas. Is there a rationale for that? And they may be produced. Will they be produced? And if not, please, why? Thank you.
Anybody else before we come back to the council? Okay, so when you're ready, if you'd like to comment on those points.
Yes, certainly, Madam. The Environment Agency have confirmed that the strategic flood risk assessment and exceptions test process has been completed to their satisfaction, and they have withdrawn their objection, and the Statement of Common Ground sets that out. That's ED 3. In relation to site-specific requirements, I think that's picked up in our proposed amendment number 26A. Notwithstanding the strategic flood risk assessment having been completed, site-specific flood risk assessments will be required in accordance with relevant national and local requirements as set out in that proposed amendment. In relation to specific flood activity, we do have here in EFDC an internal land drainage team, and they have been heavily involved and indeed would be consulted on site-specific, are consulted on site-specific proposals.
Anything further?
I'm sorry, I'm not clear where the point that Mr. Lowry made comes from. We can't immediately see it.
Which particular of my
the
3 points?
surface water point.
SWMPs. Bottom line of page 12. Further SWMPs may be produced for other areas.
Amendment 23.
Is this planned, or if not, why not, please? I'm not sure that my first 2 points were clearly answered either, I have to say.
My understanding in relation to surface water management plans is that the drainage team within the council have identified with the Environment Agency the critical drainage areas, and that surface water management plans have been produced for those areas to date. If further ones are required, then they will be undertaking that work. But I don't know what is in their programme and whether there are any further local critical drainage areas that have been identified.
The other points that Mr. Lowry made were whether you were taking account of local experience of flooding and whether there were seasonal flows had been taken into account in the flood evidence base.
Well, as I've indicated, the drainage team are aware of issues that arise and managing them on a day-to-day basis. That information has been fed through into the process in the sense that they've provided their comments on all the proposed site allocations. They were involved in the officer workshops, and indeed we now have a member of the team within the implementation team specifically dealing with drainage issues. When reviewing planning proposals, the council will assess all types of flood risk to and from the site, including the impact on groundwater and seasonal watercourses.
Thank you. Okay, moving on now to Part C of the policy. I'd asked whether requiring proposals within flood zones 2 and 3A to be informed by a site-specific flood risk assessment, FRA, was consistent with the MPPF, which requires them a wider range of circumstances. And in response, the Council has proposed Amendment 26. Which would require flood risk assessments in the circumstances set out in national policy. I'd also just ask the council, as I've noticed it's appeared in the revised schedule of changes, to add a Part H, which says site-specific flood risk assessments must be undertaken in accordance with relevant national and local requirements. Revised hydraulic modelling, including climate change allowance, will be required as part of a site-specific FRA where this is deemed necessary by the council. If you could just explain where that one's come from, and then I question whether it would be worth putting that somehow together with Part C rather than having two separate requirements on site-specific flood risk assessments.
Yes, I think this matter arose from something that we discussed during the Matter 4 hearings. It was your issue 5, question 2. So I think we've just pulled that through from one of the proposed amendments that came out of that hearing, Madam. There should also be an S, of course, on allowances. It should be climate change allowances, not allowance. That's a typographical error.
Is there any reason for that to stand apart from Part C? Are they just to help me out? Presumably they're related. It's related to site-specific flood risk assessments. Would it not make more sense for it to be combined somehow with Part C?
Yes, we can certainly look at that.
Yep. Okay. Well, I'll leave that to you to consider. Sorry, I was just reading on there because obviously Part E requires site-specific flood risk assessments as well. So sorry, I hadn't realised that when so I'll leave that with you to think about where best to place it.
Yes, I think we just put it there because I think that's what we'd agreed in the hearing 4.
Okay. The amendment is fine in principle if you just consider the best place to put it. Fine. Okay. Mr. Lowry.
Could I just query whether flood risk assessments are now to be undertaken on all sites or only those where the council deems it necessary? Because you, in your amendment that I think the council have agreed to look at, you use the phrase deemed necessary by the council. And we would, I think, prefer it on all sites.
In Part H, in the amendment to Part H, you mean?
I think we've said it has to be in accordance with relevant national requirements in there, so I don't think it's just...
So why have we got as deemed necessary by the council at the end of the Part H amendment?
That's in relation to the revised hydraulic modelling, which is the second sentence of that policy, proposed amendment. So
Can you
it's
just
the re- it
explain,
says
is that
the
in
revi-
addition to the requirements of national policy then, the revised hydraulic modelling? Is that something over and above?
Well, we have done some modelling in relation to climate change allowances as part of the SFRA. So it may not be necessary in all cases.
So if you just explain that a bit further, why it wouldn't be necessary. I can understand the point that Mr Lowry is making. If it's required in some cases, why isn't it required in all cases? It's just what's the need for that sentence?
I think the need for the sentence is that obviously we have undertaken some of that work at the strategic level, but when it comes to a site level, and depending on, I suppose, when we get further down the plan, things change. It's just to give us flexibility to require it if necessary.
So that's why I asked, is that over and above the general requirements of national policy then? It's not getting people out of doing anything.
No, I'm going to have to check that point because I don't know off the top of my head.
Well, that's fine. If you need to check, that's fine. It's just to be clear, I can see the point Mr Lowry is making. Is it sort of accepting some sites from doing something, and if it is, then for what reason? Okay.
Can I perhaps explain my point? This area is subject to meteorological and hydrological conditions which aren't necessarily typical of the nation. So a national planning framework may set out certain rules. We have a footpaths officer, and he reports back quite often that areas that have been apparently dry underfoot for almost no reason are suddenly soggy. Now, some of that is we get autumn storms, which if a farmer has just ploughed a field and then it has baked, will produce a very high runoff figure and even flash floods. This was happening, for example, in North Weald. The council installed measures which have been very successful, but those floods were not predicted, even though they were known very well to happen frequently by local residents. So I'm suggesting that, sauce for the goose, if some sites should be assessed, we believe all sites should be assessed.
Okay, thank you. We'll leave that there. I'll ask the council to have a look at that. Okay, now I propose to move on to DM16. We'll deal with sustainable drainage systems, and then we'll have a short break. Now, I'll confess that there's changes proposed here to parts A and B and also to part D of the policy. Now, I'm quite clear, I think, on what the changes are that are proposed to parts A and B, but then I got a bit lost in terms of what was proposed to part D, so I'll just ask the council to take us through it when we get to it. But if we start with parts A and B that I was clearer about. So I'd asked a question about what is meant by a drainage hierarchy and whether the methods in Part A of the policy were all permissible solutions or whether there was a sequence to it and whether that was clear. And the council has explained that the drainage hierarchy is intended to apply a sequence of approach when providing mitigation, starting with collection and the reuse of rainwater in situ, but that they're all potentially suitable solutions. Is that right? Okay.
That's correct. I should apologise as well that the text has got underlining in the amendment schedule, where of course it shouldn't have underlining because it's already in the
That's all
policy.
as is. That's okay. So the new parts are in the sort of introductory text to Part A, and then at the bottom, below point 4. but the rest is as is
That's
already.
correct.
Okay, so proposed amendments 27 and 28, if we take those first. But I think that 24, going back a few pages, is also identical to 28. Is that right? So it's duplicated, I think. Okay, so in the final schedule, we'll just get rid of one of those. 27 would amend Part A to clarify that all of the SUDS mitigation measures listed are permissible solutions, but that the drainage hierarchy requires that they be considered in order as part of decided upon which is the most appropriate. And 28 and 24, as we've already discussed, would add a reference to the Essex SUDS Design Guide and the Syria SUDS Manual to paragraph 4.118. I know that Mr. Spencer wants to comment on Part A, but in principle, does anyone have any issue with that clarifying the drainage hierarchy and its intended use? Okay. Okay, so Mr. Spencer, you've got a concern regarding A2, is that right?
Yep, that was the case. So very briefly, Ma'am, as you've probably seen from our hearing statement, my client had concerns that the drainage hierarchy in Part A was too rigid and didn't allow sufficient flexibility in the event that site-specific circumstances highlighted that one type of drainage method might not be feasible or viable. However, having now seen the Council's proposed amendments, particularly Amendment 27, we are satisfied that there's now sufficient flexibility in the wording in case there's site-specific issues. Thank you.
Thank you. That's helpful. A proposed amendment 29. Do you want to just explain that, Ms. Blom-Cooper?
I think this is picking up the point that you raised in your questions about building regulations and it being provided for within that. So we've just suggested that we reference the manual as part of the guidance to inform the SUDS rather than having this as a separate policy.
And the county councils in agreement with that, is it? Or did they not comment on that?
I don't think they commented on that.
Okay.
Did the county council comment on that?
But essentially you say it duplicates the building regulations.
Yes, so we've just, I think it's our own comment.
Any comments? Okay. Okay, and then Part D. I was basically my questions convey that my first question particularly, I was confused over which parts were intended to apply to greenfield, brownfield, major, non-major development, and then there were a couple of specific questions there. Concerning discharge to a sewer as well as a watercourse and runoff rates. These are issues that were raised by Essex County Council. In response, the Council has proposed some amendments to Part D as 30 to 32. The 30 and 32 in particular sort of seem to overlap to some extent, with some bits put in one and some bits put in another, and I wasn't particularly clear about them. So I wondered if you could just take us through the proposed amendments to Part D of the policy and why they're required, and then we'll see if anyone has any comments about them.
We hadn't spotted that one, so I apologise. They should be part of one amendment, and they do refer to the statement of common ground that we've made with Essex County Council. And you're quite right, they should be part of the same amendment. There shouldn't be two separate ones. We've sought to also add to the glossary the definition of major and minor developments in order to, in accordance with the GDMPO, in order to provide a bit more clarity.
So how is it intended that Part D would look at the end of this amendment? Would you have parts 1, 2, 3 and 4 all remaining, but amended in some way?
Yes, Madam. I think we should bring forward the amendment from number 32 for D little 1, and that is the correct amendment that should have been referenced there. And then the others are correct with no amendment to little 4. I understand we've also missed off from the site to a sewer and or water course from little 2 from this. So in short, I think we need to go back and consolidate it. And
okay, and I think probably need to consolidate that so that we can see it more clearly. But I think one of my original questions really was whether Part 1 was supposed to apply to greenfield sites and Part 2 to brownfield sites, whether there was a different requirements for greenfield and brownfield sites. I think that's still not clear.
Can I suggest that we go away and have a look at this and bring it back rather than try and do it now?
Yep, okay. People content with that approach? Okay, in doing that, if you just look again at the questions I asked perhaps, and if you can just sort of present the amendments you think are required and just give a brief explanation of what you've changed. Because I was confused over the greenfield and brownfield bit as much as anything else. And I'm not sure that that's changed. Okay, we'll leave it there. There's really no point in going on with it now. Okay, we'll have a short break and then we'll come back to DM 17. So if we come back at 25:02. Okay. Oh, you're still here. Sorry, Dr. Warren. You haven't disappeared. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I saw your board and then didn't see you there, but thank you. Okay, so we'll carry on now with DM 17, protecting and enhancing watercourses and flood defences. And the question here essentially relates, I think, to the 8-metre buffer zone referred to in the policy. And you can see here that we have proposed Amendment 33A as superseding 33. And it states here that this is a result of discussions with the Canal and River Trust and has been agreed by the Environment Agency. So before we have a long discussion, Ms. Craig, sorry, I realised we had a break just before you were due to come on. Does this address your concerns, or do you have further comments that you need to make?
Yes, we're satisfied that this provides enough flexibility for building within the 8-metre buffer zone where it's appropriate. So, yeah, we're happy with the amended wording.
And the Environment Agency is also content with the wording?
Yes, we've had email confirmation from the Environment Agency to that effect, but it's not included in the Statement of Common Ground.
And as you'll hear from the... Could you just explain briefly why you think that this amendment is necessary? It would be helpful, thank you.
Yes, so we think that there's cases where it's appropriate to build within the 8-metre buffer zone where it will provide a better development, often where there's strips of land left alongside the waterway. It can result in spaces for antisocial behaviour and littering and things. So we feel that often there's cases where if there's building within that buffer, it can provide passive surveillance and a sort of a better relationship with the waterway.
And is the council itself content with that amendment?
Yes, we are.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other comments? Okay, thank you, Ms. Craig. I don't know whether you intend to stay for the rest or whether you want to make your exit, but thank you, that's very helpful. Thank you. Okay. DM 18. Okay, so Thames Water had indicated that Part B of the policy should be revised to reflect changes from the way water and wastewater infrastructure is to be delivered from April 18. Perhaps again, if I could just ask the council to briefly explain what the changes are and explain proposed amendment 34.
Yes, certainly, Madam. It's set out in our hearings statement in response to your question 38. But prior to April 2018, developers were normally required to liaise with water and sewerage undertakers on the cost of providing waste and water infrastructure on a case-by-case basis. However, the Water Act 2014, which came into effect in April 2018, now requires water and wastewater companies to provide the necessary infrastructure through a fixed upfront fee from developers. So the agreed Statement of Common Ground with the Council, the Environment Agency and Thames Water, and that's document ED3, includes a proposed amendment, which is the Amendment 34 in the schedule to Policy DM 18 to take account of that change.
Thank you. Any comments? Yep. Okay, and then finally, in relation to my questions, I'd asked whether it was necessary to amend the wording of the second sentence in paragraph 4.131 for clarity, and proposed amendment 35 is the council's response. I realise there's a couple of other small amendments, not just to the second sentence, but do you want to explain that briefly?
Yes, there are. Sorry. It was just in order to tidy up the policy, really, in response to your question, we then had another look at the supporting text and felt that the further amendments should be made as set out there. So the amendments are underlined.
Thank you. Any comments? No. Anything further on DM18? Thank you. DM19?
Could you just give us a minute to switch around?
You can, whether you'll need to for DM19 is questionable, but that's fine. It helps me catch up on my notes. Okay. Okay, so simply I'd asked whether it was justified to refer to the Code for Sustainable Homes in the supporting text in paragraph 4.139. And as that has been withdrawn now, the Council has proposed Amendment 36. And it's essentially just proposed to replace the reference to the Code for Sustainable Homes with the Home Quality Mark technical manual. I think we discussed something very similar yesterday and said essentially it's not intended to change the requirements or the interpretation of policy. It was just to bring the supporting text up to date with current guidance. Unless anyone has any concerns about that, I think as we said yesterday, that could just be an additional amendment for updating. Mr. Faulkner, I think you had some comments.
Thank you, Mum. It was just really the question of the council looking to apply a more rigorous standard. Clearly, building regulations set a high watermark, pardon the pun, in terms of standards, in terms of water consumption. And clearly the council are looking to obviously go beyond that. And clearly we would question whether there's a need for that or whether there could be a case that the council just could look to apply the new national standards. And the question whether there is the evidence base there, why. It's really a question if obviously you are looking to apply a higher standard, it obviously has a knock-on effect in terms of viability more generally across schemes. Just adding to the actual burden for developers and landowners in terms of bringing sites forward.
Thank you. I mean, I noticed that in respect of applying the higher optional standards that it states in paragraph 4.135 of the plan that it's an area of water stress. I don't know if you could just give us a little bit of an idea about what that is and whether that justifies in itself the higher standard required.
As you rightly point out, this is an area of serious water stress, and that's a classification by the Environment Agency. And in such areas, they do recommend that there is implementation of water efficiency standards in order to manage demand on the water environment. And I'd also draw your attention in that regard to 4.136 as well, which sets that out, and the optional building regulations requirement there for the higher standard.
Sorry, can you just repeat what you said about the Environment Agency recommends that in areas of water stress you should?
And in such areas, it's recommended that there is implementation of water efficiency standards in order to manage demand on the water environment. And it's actually mentioned in paragraph 4.135 already. And therefore it's recommended that we have the higher requirement.
On that basis, Ms Faulkner, do you have any reason to dispute that?
No, Mum.
Thank you. Mr Lowry.
Strongly support Council's determination to achieve higher standards here. You've already mentioned local water stress. Add to that the likely impact of climate change, and 2 days ago a national report about a looming water crisis in southern England. So very much that would be covered, many of those would be covered by hopefully rises in national standards as in Part C. I would just like to query Part B. I want somehow the Council to perhaps insert the word exceptional. I don't want them to have to fight every developer saying it's not feasible on technical or viability grounds. This should be as close as possible to an absolute standard that is required. Thank you.
Did you want to comment?
No, if you consider that wouldn't affect the standards of the plan, we'd be happy to include that.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr Lowry. Anything else on DM19? Okay, moving on to DM20, low carbon and renewable energy. Okay, my first question, 41. Should the supporting text make reference to the exceptions which apply to designated and non-designated heritage assets in respect of the need to comply with the energy efficiency requirements of the building regulations? And the Council has proposed an additional paragraph as proposed Amendment 37 to the supporting text to explain the exemptions. Was Historic England content with the amendment?
Yes, indeed, Madam, they were, and it's in the Statement of Common Ground with Historic England. But I should say that in rereading this morning, we realised that the second sentence did not read very well. And so we are going to go back to them and propose a slight modification so that it reads in line with Part L of the Building Regulations. Special consideration should be given to locally, and then the rest. I don't think they're going to have a problem with that. I just didn't read very well.
Thank you. Mr Lowry.
Strongly support that.
Thank you. Okay, and then I asked in Part D, which requires strategic master plans to demonstrate how infrastructure for district heating could be incorporated. Is this justified by reference to viability? And then, for example, it has been suggested that the development of 950 dwellings, such as proposed at South Epping, would be too small to viably deliver a district heating scheme. That was raised in the representations mentioned there. Now, first of all, if I could just ask the Council to explain its proposed Amendment 38, and then we'll take comments from Mr Spencer and Mr Keane.
Thank you, Madam. The Council proposes an amendment to policy DM20, which, as you say, is amendment number 38 on the schedule, in order to remove reference to the combined heat and power and combined cooling heat and power, in order to clarify and future-proof the policy. Those amendments are based on recent increases to decarbonisation of the grid electricity, as demonstrated by the recently published updated carbon emissions factors, and particularly refer you to the DEFRA Greenhouse Gas Reporting Conversion Factors 2018 and the draft SAP 10 carbon factors. The impact of these new emission factors is significant in that technologies generating on-site electricity, such as gas engine CHP and solar PV, will not achieve the carbon savings they have to date. And that has amendment, and we have discussed with the BRE, and they suggested that in order to future-proof the policy, we should amend it in the way I've just outlined. And I should also say it reflects what the Chancellor said in his spring statement, also to mandate the end of fossil fuel systems by 2025. So it just reflects, you know, the latest thinking, as it were, on these matters.
Thank you. Can we hear from Mr. Keane and then Mr. Spencer?
Thank you, Ma'am. I think when I look at DM20, this is really a question of the emphasis in the policy. We don't really have any problem with the encouragement given to low carbon and renewable energy as set out in sections A and B of the policy. That seems perfectly appropriate, and we endorse that. It is just a bit hard to understand why the District Council are so wedded to district heating systems, etc., in the proposed new developments and the strategic master plans in particular. It's difficult to find any real evidence that such technologies are really viable or deliverable in this type of urban extension. I think the sort of the plan itself hints at some of the issues in paragraphs supporting paragraphs 4.146 and paragraph 4.147. It's not just a question of the scale of development, it's also development mix in terms of the way the energy demands are managed. To cut to the chase in terms of how you could improve the policy and make it more robust. In many ways, I can't really see the point in having the long references to the combined heating systems. I think what really is required is that the policy demands that strategic master plans should be accompanied probably by energy statements that show how low carbon and energy measures can be encouraged in the master plan areas, and it would consider all the technologies and look at the most appropriate solution. And of course, district heating systems could be one of those solutions proposed, ma'am.
Mr. Spencer.
Thank you, Ma'am. As you've probably seen in our hearing statement, my client doesn't support the requirement in Part D for district heating to be included on strategic developments. We can't find any evidence to demonstrate that district heating is appropriate or necessarily deliverable on the edge of Harlow or specifically at the east of Harlow site. And as the Garden Town viability assessment is yet to be published, it's uncertain whether district heating could harm the viability of strategic development around Harlow. So, in summary, my client's asking for Part D to be deleted from the policy.
The council come back on that and perhaps explain, first of all, why you feel that district heating is the most appropriate solution.
I don't think we are saying that it's the most appropriate solution. Policy little d, which would become little c, actually says the master plans will be required to demonstrate how the potential could be provided. We're not saying it has to be provided. So we're asking them to consider it as one of a range of options. And indeed, other systems may be more appropriate in different locations. Turning to the viability point, our viability study, Stage 2, EB 301, provides further detail on assumptions underpinning infrastructure viability and further commentary on the viability assumptions included. That work, as you've already heard, feeds into the Garden Town work, and we'll take forward that work into that. We haven't had any indication, and it has been the subject of discussion with the strategic sites, any indication that the inclusion of this policy would make it unviable.
Sorry, so just to be clear, is it the intention of Part D that it is that district heating is one of the options that should be considered alongside others, or is it that is your preferred option, and that you must demonstrate that you can't provide that before going on to anything else? Because I think, as worded, I would tend to the latter. If it's that it's something that, if it's that it's an option that needs to be considered alongside others, then I think perhaps that there should be a change of emphasis.
I think we saw it as our starting point, and for developments and strategic master plan areas to consider that first, and what the potential is for bringing that forward. But if it wasn't deemed to be the most appropriate for that site or location, then we would consider other options. I draw you particularly in terms of looking at the viability point to paragraphs 111 to 113 of our hearing statement.
And again, I'll say this isn't something I know an enormous amount about, I have to say. So I was wondering if you could explain, for my benefit, why that would be your preferred solution. What is the reason for preferring that over potentially other solutions? Why is the sort of tilt towards that as a solution? And if it is, what's the evidence to show that that's right?
I think I'd draw your attention to the paragraphs of supporting text, which is already in the local plan submission version, particularly 4.145. It is a system supported by national policy as a form of renewable or low carbon energy, and as a means of meeting requirements of climate change. It also, in my experience, has the benefit for the end user of being very cost efficient. And in terms of evidence base, we had a study done in 2013, which is the Council's Carbon Reduction and Renewable Energy Assessment. If that isn't in our evidence base, I can make sure that it's added to it. But that is the basis for the work that's been taken forward.
And obviously, this is something that I'll have a look at. But you say it's a system supported by national policy. Is it a preferred solution of national policy? I'm just trying to get to why the sort of preference is for this as opposed to other potential solutions.
I think it is a preferred solution for larger sites because it only works with a critical mass of development. Certainly the BRE and the conversations we've had with them recently, and they are the experts in this field, have recommended that we should retain this when they had a look at our policy recently.
Thank you. Mr. Lowry.
To pick up on with the district heating should have the apparent emphasis it has in DM20. Renewable energy is an evolving science. Last year we were told that PV is on the roof with a thing, and now we're told something else. This plan is going to sit around for 20 years, say. I want us to future-proof it by having all available and future sources of renewable, which may include district heating, but I'm worried that we fossilise ourselves with old technology. I have an emphasis on it here. I do take the point that all the others get mentioned somewhere else, but it's in DM20 specifically, and obviously I share the developers' concern about the viability.
Just a bit of anecdotal information, if you like, Ma'am, but as a company, we're involved with very many major urban extensions across the country. The only one at the moment where we have any system of this, broadly of this type, is a new settlement at Cranbrook in Devon. But that was only made possible by a very substantial public sector grant. So there was a lot of money poured into the system, and it comes back. And there's also a scale issue here in terms of this was thousands of houses, and it's also balanced by a major employment area as well. So it's a balance. I'm like you. I'm not an expert in this subject, but it appears to balance the load out because the employment takes it in the day and the residential takes it in the night. But you know, I won't go any further because I shall stray beyond my technical competence, but it may be something the council might just like to have a look at when they think about these issues. Thank you, Ma'am.
Thank you. Mr. Spencer. All right, okay. Thank you. Anything from the council?
Yeah, just to say that the study I referred to is on the in the evidence base, and it's EB 1604. And Appendix 1 of the document. So there's a background paper and synopsis.
Thank you. Thank you.
And also just to say that, particularly in relation to the East of Harlow site, we do think it should be considered because if we're going to have a hospital there and about 3,000 homes across the site within the two districts, then we think that that is the site where it certainly should be looked at. And the potential for how to incorporate it as part of that development.
Thank you. Thank you. Anything else on DM20? Okay, so we move on to our last policy of the day. So it's DM21. Local environmental impacts, pollution and land contamination. Okay, and my question, as you can see there, again related to concerns raised by Historic England about the historic environment. In response, the council has proposed amendment 39, which is to amend Part E of the policy, which essentially is to recognise the challenge presented by historic buildings. You can read that for yourself. And again, is this something agreed in the Statement of Common Ground?
Yes, it is, Madam.
Thank you.
It's ED 24.
Anyone, any comments on that specific amendment? No. And anything else on DM 21? No. Thank you. So that concludes my questions. Everyone said everything they wanted to say about the DM policies that were discussed today. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you to everybody for your inputs today and yesterday. And so we end today at 12:05, and we will be back again in May. So wishing everybody a happy Easter in advance. And see you again in May. Thank you.